Kelsey, you'll get to a seat.
Yes.
One big motion to pass the report. Yeah.
Well, good morning, everybody, and welcome to new quarters for the next this meeting and the next meeting. I'd like to introduce, before we start, a new committee member, Jeremy Zanon, sitting next to me. Welcome, Jeremy. You've got an easy start. Boy, some of us started with about 15 items, which all took an hour, and, you know, it's very complicated. Anyway, a reminder, the microphones are live all the time, and you may need to move them since they're not right in front of you as in Council Hall. But I think at least you can hear here that they are working. You have an agenda. Do I have any additions to the agenda? Yes, Mr. Neal.
You asked for somebody to approve.
Oh, you want to approve the removal of the agenda if there are no changes? Certainly. Moved by Councillor Neal, seconder by Don Taylor. Thank you. Any comments? Seeing none, those in favour, you have an agenda to follow then. A confirmation of the minutes of February, which you received online, February the 20th. Firstly, a mover who was present at that meeting, Don, a seconder, thank you. That was Jane. Questions, comments, corrections, Don?
Just a couple of minor things. It was a long meeting and complicated minutes, but I'd like to make a couple minor changes. One is on page 9, where the I was attributed with the inclusion of quarter joints on the elevator shaft. I'm not sure exactly what words I used, but those are not the words. So I'd like to change that to cornice trim. I don't know what I said then, but make it cornice trim.
Not a problem, Don. My inexperience with the heritage world is showing. And could I just get you to pull the one microphone a little bit closer for the stream?
Okay.
Thank you.
And the other one is on page 13, where I was suggesting that an L-shaped road would be preferable. That wasn't my message. It was the suggestion that an L-shaped single building might be considered. So if you just put that in instead there.
Yep.
No, I think, Don, we realise that when we're dealing with technicalities that it's very difficult, especially in the council chamber hearing, sometimes to get those exact words down. So we appreciate, and I'm sure Derek appreciates, getting the corrections at the next meeting. Other comments, corrections, observations on these minutes? They've been moved and seconded. So those in favour of approval, those opposed, thank you. You have a set of minutes. Now I've lost my front page. There we go. Disclosure of pecuniary interest. And seeing none. Presentations. Delegations. Briefings. Business. Cultural heritage. Now, we were talking yesterday, Jennifer, about how you wanted to do this, and I'll leave this section up to you as to what order you want to do them in.
Yeah, for sure. Thank you, and through you. I just wanted to take some space in the agenda very quickly to offer just a heads up about some community events that are happening that we've been talking about at the committee. I put cards on everyone's desks this morning, and I have some for the general public if they would like. But this is the Your Stories, Our Histories storytelling launch event that I'm drawing attention to here. The information about the event is not on the card, but if you were to go to the website, you would see it. So on Tuesday, March 26th at 7 p.m. at the Royal Canadian Legion on Montreal, we're having a storytelling event. And so 5 community storytellers will be joining us to talk about stories, storytelling, and why this is important as a way of kind of seeing ourselves in our community. The other thing I wanted to draw to the attention of the committee is an event that will be happening on Thursday, April 4th, which is the opening of the Ontario Street exhibition at the Pump House Museum. We will be sending this out to you directly, hopefully through Derek as a communication, but it is ahead of the next meeting. The show this year at the Pump House is on the development of Ontario Street, and I think it's of great interest probably to a number of the members of this committee. It looks at some of the properties on Ontario Street and how they have developed over time, and how the street itself has quote-unquote grown up to be the street that we know it to be today. So just wanted to put those out there. We didn't have a space in the agenda for kind of updates, so that's what I want to offer. Thank you.
Questions or comments there? Seeing none, thank you, Jennifer. Policy development implementation. Requests for commemorations.
Thank you again. It's very odd to be down here doing this. All right, I'm here today just to introduce this report, which is an update to the committee about the Kingston commemorations policy and how it has been functioning. This policy went up for its first review last year, and now that it is reviewed and in full-time operation, we have committed to reporting on its use through this committee. Because commemorations are, of course, kind of in the mandated group of topics for this committee to cover. So the Kingston commemoration policy and strategy document are useful and helpful for us in terms of defining a commemoration for, particularly for requests that we receive for additions to commemorations or new commemorations on city property or on city-sponsored events and sites. So for us, a commemoration is, of course, an intentional act of acknowledging the memory of people, places, events, and ideas, public, private, national, local, tangible, intangible, monumental, modest in scale, permanent, or temporary. So it's a pretty encompassing definition. All right. For a long time, the City of Kingston had a number of different policy documents or strategies or processes under which commemorations would fall. They were shared across a number of departments. So this policy actually brought all of them together for the first time into this overarching commemoration policy and associated strategy. And it allows us now to respond much more quickly and effectively to community requests for commemoration, and to also channel those requests to the appropriate departments, to the appropriate contact points, and if necessary, to bring them to the appropriate committees for further discussion and development. So these are requests that we receive that have to do, importantly, with city property or that require city approvals. Commemorations, public art, and other things that happen on private land are, of course, not the purview of this policy or of our responsibility. In the strategy document, just for this committee's sort of knowledge base, commemorations requests fall into one of three categories. The first is category A, and this category is really the most expedient way of getting an approval for something. These are things that can be approved by usually a single staff or staff group and don't require any kind of consultation beyond the existing policy or structure. These are fairly regimented processes. Council motions, congratulations, recognition, sympathy, condolences, for example, managed through the clerk's department. Tree bench dedications through our public works department, for example. More consideration and a little bit more work, if you will, in terms of the request process itself. So these can be things like proclamation requests, again through clerks, flag raising, heritage property markers, something this committee would be more familiar with, as well as the illumination of City Hall. These are things like Kingston Remembers plaques, which can be multiple pages if they're book plaques like we have outside of City Hall, where we are taking more complicated or detailed histories and presenting them for public consumption in public spaces. This can also include things like the addition or renovation of existing physical monuments. Sometimes we get requests for people to want to change things, and also requests for long-term physical commemorations that people want to have installed in our public spaces. And festivals events do fall in this category as well. Commemorations category C is of particular interest because of how we then are able to process it through the policy and the strategy document. Right now we receive requests through either web submissions or through the HRC, the Heritage Resource Center. They then come to culture, our department, the department that I'm with, to basically funnel or align to the correct department. If they're in category A or B, they're likely to get passed to the relevant department, and that department will move them through the relevant process. Category C is a bit more complicated, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about that in a moment. In the report, what we're presenting right now is sort of Q1 of 2019, what are the commemorations requests that we have received and that are in process? The green here, sorry, let me get myself organized. The green blocks are Category A requests, those that are most expedient and easy for us to process. The sort of tan color on this screen are those that are in Category B, and so they require a slightly more involved process, but are still fairly easy and fairly procedurally driven. The ones I want to draw our attention to are those that are represented here in that kind of mustard color. These are the Category C requests, and you see commemoration form not yet defined. These are commemorations that this committee, if these move forward, will see for conversation. These are usually requests for permanent installations on public land to commemorate something fairly significant in the development of Kingston or in an ethnocultural community. And as that is such a permanent process, it will require the opportunity for this committee, as well as its working groups, to feed in on the form, the type, the location, et cetera. So just wanted to talk a little bit more about that process so that you can understand when and how you will be invited into that dialogue. If we receive those Category Cs, and we have, and the reason why they're not listed by type yet is that we don't want to block them in. Right now we've had requests from, these are largely 3 commemorative works that would involve the creation of public art. And so you can imagine that that is a fairly complicated and complex conversation. So we've received that request at this point. It has been reviewed and coordinated by our department. It will now go to the interdepartmental commemorations group that has representatives from all of the related departments that were shown before. After those interdepartmental group meets and reviews, they're asking, does it meet the guidelines of the strategy document? And if it gets a green light, then we start to go back to the proposer and discuss what does that need to look like, how can we shape it in a way that is best suited to the need of the city as well as to the proponent. It would then come to public consultation, and this is where Heritage Kingston would be invited to give feedback and input on this application process. At the end of the day, if the cost of the installation is less than $50,000, Council has given delegated authority to directors to approve those requests. Funding typically comes from the individual bringing the request forward. In that community group, there is very limited budget to support separate commemorations, though it is possible if we receive direction to do so. If it's above $50,000, then the request would go to Council. So that's all I really wanted to present today, and I'm happy to answer questions about either the type, the form, the process. Every quarter, we will be bringing a report like this forward to Heritage Kingston. This will become more routine and sort of rote, where you will get to see the kinds of requests we're receiving and the frequency with which we process them. Thank you.
Questions to, yes, Jim?
Yes, if I might. Councillors often get requests for naming parks, or, and I know that you kind of reviewed the policy, but I know it used, first of all, would that kind of request for naming a street or a park commemoratively come through this process?
Yes.
And if so, I know that we've waived that on occasion. The Tragically Hip Way, although I never voted for it, was passed despite the fact that everybody was still living. And could you explain the criteria for naming of streets or parks?
I think I could like to speak to the criteria on the highest level of the strategy, if I may. Street namings and parks have separate policies that fall under the commemorations policy. It's an umbrella strategy. So the first is, can you get through the umbrella? And if you can, then you get processed back to those specific requests. The categories that we consider, there are a couple of things that when a request comes through. One of the things we're looking at is balancing the commemorative representation in the Kingston community. So there are a number of groups that have been recognized as needing or requiring balance in the commemorative aspect. So we have ethnocultural communities, Indigenous communities, the roles of women, the Francophone community, and sport are considered underrepresented commemorative acts. Second to that, the question becomes, has the individual or the event, so to speak, been 10 years since the occurrence of that process? And if it hasn't, then we would say no, it would not meet one of those primary requirements. Funding becomes some of the secondary consideration, et cetera. In instances where it doesn't meet the strategic guidelines of the policy document, the interdepartmental working group or the individual department would turn down the request. We do communicate to anyone who requests something that you can advocate to council. Council does always have the ability to request direct staff to act outside the directions of the strategy. And we would not encourage that to happen frequently, but we do recognize that exceptional circumstances can require us to do so.
I'll run an example by you. For the last 9 years, I guess now, I have lobbied for the idea of having some recognition for Simon Whitfield. He's living, he's now retired, but naming a track or a sports field or something would make sense. But how would that not fit into the criteria?
So it wouldn't fit into the criteria in that the individual is still alive. I know that sounds like a very morbid way to turn this, but that would be one of the first considerations. But there are also processes available that are not commemorative. So defining the act of commemoration versus the act of recognition can be a significant difference. So there is a corporate naming policy for assets, resources, parks, and the like that can be an alternate avenue of pursuing something of that nature that isn't about commemoration in the same way as it's about naming rights. And so these do fall under that umbrella of the policy, but offer an alternate route in, if you will. Otherwise, at this point, if it was to come as a straight commemorations request through the application of our strategy document, the request would be declined, and the direction would be to pursue it as the renaming of a corporate asset, or alternately, to lobby or advocate through a councillor.
Yeah, or with 2/3 of council to waive it in that one condition, which is, I believe, what we ended up doing with the Tragically Hip Way.
The renaming of Tragically Hip Way was actually one of those events that precipitated the development of a strategy and policy document because it emphasized the lack of clarity about how those processes ought to unfold. The naming of the Gord Edgar Downey Pier is actually a more recent renaming or naming that would have not been approved through a straight application of this strategy document, but was deemed by 2/3 of council to be something they wanted to pursue.
Do you want to comment on that, Mr. Newman?
Through you, Mr. Chair, I think actually Jen has done a good job. Thanks.
Good. Other questions? My one would be, when you showed those figures, they were all approved. How many are unapproved? Any idea?
Sorry if I may move these back. Everything on the screen that you're seeing right now has been approved except for those in the mustard color because they were moved through those internal processes and were easily then able to have been received, responded to, and actioned. But the ones that haven't at this point are those commemorations not yet defined, though it is possible in future, and I can include this in future reports, how many we actually saw requests for versus how many were approved as an outcome of that process. I think that would be an interesting data point for sure.
Other questions? Otherwise, the committee will note the heritage building plaques, and we move on then to statutory business, 55 Stewart Street. I forgot to ask whether this counts as part 4 or part 5. That's what I thought, it was a part 4. Okay.
Does anyone object for me speaking from here as opposed to at the front? It seems a bit like an awkward position up there at the front, so this is okay with everyone? Okay.
You'll need that at some point. You don't need it.
Okay, so we have before us today an application for alteration under Part 4 of the Ontario Heritage Act, submitted for the subject property at 55 Stewart Street. So the subject property is located on Queen's Campus, north of Stewart Street, between University Avenue and Arch Street. The property is known locally as Summer Hill and is quite an impressive landmark building on Queen's University's main campus. As you can see in this photo, it's quite a cool building. So Summerhill was designated in 1981 under Part 4 of the Act. The designating bylaw for the property states This large villa, built over the years 1836 to 1839 for Archdeacon George Oakhill Stewart, was one of the most impressive country estates in Upper Canada, with its central block and wing stretching 168 feet across a rise facing Lake Ontario. Summerhill achieved distinction beyond its size and site, with formal elements of pillars, porticos, and parapets. The property was purchased in 1853 to house the growing Queen's College, now Queen's University. The university continued to grow on these grounds and the surrounding lands. Summerhill became home to a variety of related purposes as the university grew. Notably, it has served historically as the official residence of the university's principals. The property remains central to the university's main campus today. And of note, the property is not currently subject to the city's easement agreement with Queen's University, registered in 1998. It is, however, subject to an easement agreement with the Ontario Heritage Trust, which was registered in 1992. The proposed alterations are specific to the eastern wing of Summerhill, which is formally named Agnes Benedictson House in 2010 in order to honor the former chancellor. The wing is presently used to house and accommodate formal guests of the university. An accessible entrance to this wing is not presently available, which university representatives have noted creates substantial challenges for guests to the university. The 2014 Queen's University Master Plan outlines a vision to build a campus community that is inclusive for all individuals and ensures that its services and spaces are accessible for persons with disabilities. So as such, the applicant is proposing to introduce a barrier-free ramp extending from the main entrance of the Benedictson wing. Interventions to satisfy accessibility needs and related Ontario Building Code requirements. As we know, in heritage properties often serves to be a challenge, as these buildings were not originally designed with these present-day accessibility standards in mind. This subject property at Summerhill also poses additional challenges given the steep grading of the site and the historic associations with its landscape. So the location of the property on a hill facing Lake Ontario is fundamental to its construction and evident in the Summerhill name. Additionally, the applicant has noted that the arboretum on the south side of the property, so at the front of the building there, is one of the oldest in the province and is noted as an historic attribute by the university. The applicant has worked with the university's accessibility specialists, arborists, engineers, and others in development of the application you'll see today. So the original proposal submitted by the applicant, which was what was originally circulated to Heritage Kingston, shows a barrier-free ramp with an angular switchback. So upon review by city staff, Ontario Heritage Trust staff, and Heritage Kingston members, the applicant was provided with a number of comments taking issue with the size, visual impact, and the angular design of the ramp. Comments suggested that the applicant might consider utilizing another entrance or elongating the ramp to mimic the existing pathways on the property. The applicant confirmed that use of the other entrances to this wing were not feasible given accessibility principles to utilize main entrances, the configuration of the historic building, so there are a number of walls and kind of odd exits in the rear of the building, and the steep slope of the property, so the applicant notes it's about 45-degree grade on the side where you see that sunroom there, so it would be quite difficult and challenging to introduce a ramp at this location. Additionally, the applicant noted that an elongated ramp without a switchback would not meet the accessibility standards of the code or of the university's principles, as rest areas are required at intervals, and that in this case a handrail would likely be required along the entirety of the ramp, thus increasing the overall visual impact of this alteration. So the applicant continued to work internally with their specialists and team and ultimately returned with a revised proposal, which I'll show you here. So here's a rendering of that. So the applicant was able to determine that by increasing the grade surrounding the ramp by 4 inches, the switchback could be removed from the proposal while maintaining an appropriate slope for accessibility principles. This revision was circulated via email to Heritage Kingston members ahead of today's meeting. However, the revised rendering is not included in your staff report. Heritage staff and Ontario Heritage Trust staff were pleased with these revisions as they served to mitigate concerns and comments regarding the size and visual impacts of the ramp. And with this revised proposal, the applicant has indicated that they don't anticipate another stone will need to be added to the steps, and they can also eliminate that handrail kind of along the porch and along the other side of the steps, ultimately kind of reducing that visual impact. So the applicant has also submitted landscaping plans with the revised rendering for staff's review, which are seen here and will serve to further mitigate the visual impacts of the ramp when you're looking at Summerhill House there. So to align with the university's accessibility and design standards, the applicant is also seeking heritage approval to remove the existing pavers on the walkway that leads to Benedictson House and to replace with a concrete walkway with stone paver bandings. The pavers at this walkway are not original pavers. The applicant is also proposing to introduce a new walkway that joins the Benedictson House entrance with the main Summerhill entrance stairs. This area does not currently have a walkway and is just grassed and is therefore unusable in the winter months. The applicant notes that the university has design standards which stipulate that concrete walkways with stone bandings are to be used throughout the university's campus during any alterations or new construction for consistency purposes and accessibility standards. Finally, the applicant is also requesting permission to introduce 2 new small vent openings to the rear of the property to serve a washroom and a dryer. And the locations are shown here in the images. So to summarize, it is staff's opinion that the proposed barrier-free ramp will have some visual impact on Benedictson House as a result of its size and location on the property. However, upon review of the application against applicable policies, including Parks Canada's standards and guidelines, and through conversations with university and Ontario Heritage Trust representatives, staff are satisfied that the proposal aligns with applicable policy and aims to minimize impacts on the heritage attributes of the property. The work as proposed is ultimately reversible, and the barrier-free ramp will provide enhanced access to this valued heritage resource in accordance with the goals of Kingston's official plan. University representatives have put considerable time and effort into the proposal ahead of you today in order to thoughtfully balance accessibility needs with heritage conservation on the property. And so the committee knows the Ontario Heritage Trust has confirmed that the works comply with the terms of the easement agreement and have issued approval to the applicant on the revised plans that were shown to you today. As such, staff recommend approval of this application subject to the conditions outlined in front of you. And I'll also note that I've spoken to the chair about the recommendation with a couple of additional words just to align with the revised proposal. So maybe I'll let the chair speak to that.
The suggestion is that recommendation 2 have added to after it if required, so the introduction of 1 new stone step to match existing if required, and similarly item 3, installation of handrails along each side of the steps and 1 handrail along the edge of the upper landing if required. Does that mean just the last part of that, or the handrails along each side of the steps if required in number 3?
For both, it would be
For both,
if required.
okay.
So the applicant anticipates that they will not need, given the rise of the grade, but they haven't they haven't gotten their building permit yet, so they just want to have some flexibility there in case.
So both recommendation 2 and 3 have if required added after them.
So just when we, Mr. Chair, when we get to the sort of approval point, that will require a formal amendment.
Okay.
So we'll keep you in mind after the discussion.
Thank you, and we'll assume that they are up on the screen and easily readable by everybody. Any further do you want to add? Ready for questions?
Nothing for me. We also have representatives of the university here, so the planner and the project coordinator.
Do you want to add anything to that presentation? Okay. Questions from committee? Mr. Neal?
It's probably the wrong time for a comment, but I do want to say site plan and the new design is much improved. Site plan can mask all kinds of sins, and the site plan that's proposed here makes it a much more, it fits in much better with the heritage nature of the property. So I think it's a very good proposal, trying to balance the requirements to make a building accessible and maintain it as a functional modern building. Those kind of goals, I think, are achieved with this. So, well done.
Well, thank you for positive comments. We don't always get them, Mr. Hill. Yes, Zoe.
I just have a question about the replacement of the stones with it looks like a more flat cement pave. If you just go back to the revised, yeah. So just the cutoff that it shows here seems a really awkward position.
Yeah, so through you, Mr. Chair, is this on? Okay.
Yep.
Sorry, I can't tell if I'm just in my head or not. So yeah, the way that it's shown in here, that will actually extend all the way to meet up with the driveway, as I understand it, which is where the accessible parking spot is. So it will be a concrete walkway with stone bandings along the side, and that will be consistent all the way up to the stairs.
Okay, so it's...
So the way it's shown there, yeah, there won't be that kind of weird.
Okay. So the path that I'm looking at here that starts at the bottom left and goes straight to that door up there will be flat pave. And the stones will all be removed along that side, but I also don't see any stones in front of the main stairs of the building. Are there stones there currently?
No, so right now there's no, in front of those stairs where you see, there's not currently any walkway at that point. It's just
Okay.
grass. So those stairs actually aren't really used in the winter.
Okay.
So they're going to be introducing that new concrete ramp, and then along the sides there will be stone bandings, but the whole flat ramp will be concrete.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
I think so. I'm just trying to picture the continuation of it rather than, I mean, this has an awkward stop, but I'm not sure if it's going to be a flat strip with stones on one side or if this is all going to be one uniform flat piece.
Yeah, so it will be all uniform
Okay.
concrete with stone along the edges of the walkway, kind of lining the walkway there.
Thank you.
Good, thank you. Other questions? Done?
Yes, I'm also a little concerned about the replacement of pavers with concrete, and this was explained as an outcome of the university's policy. To me, I'm not sure I agree with that policy, or at least I like it. For one of the points that have to do with heritage works is reversibility. Pouring concrete walks is a pretty irreversible process, and whereas pavers can be fixed and mended and moved and so on without so much disruption. Also, if this is well, I guess my question is this really a general university policy? Because after all, the university has a number of old heritage buildings. It has a number of new modern buildings. It would make sense to me to say, okay, the new buildings, let's go with concrete. But the old buildings, maybe we should consider pavers. So is there some flexibility on that?
Thank you, and through you, Mr. Chair. The policy was developed around landscaping because we found, last time we did the campus master plan, that we had pockets of different pavers, pockets of different concrete with every new project. So every 10 years it would be the flavor of the day, and it really created a sense of the campus of a lack of continuity. So a campus standard was established to both address accessibility and to address unifying the campus in terms of landscape. The pavers you see at the bottom are brick pavers, I think, from a vintage of the 80s. They're not particularly, they don't particularly speak to the house. The concrete that we currently use and a paver banding is, you can see it in front of the work that was done in Kingston Hall, Theological Hall, and around our heritage buildings, and it does quite a lovely job of tying in. The pavers that are located at the sides are actually more consistent with what you would find in an older structure. So we're maintaining that heritage look with a banding, but the path of travel really is a flat surface to ensure accessibility. Does that help?
Yes, I guess I have another question. Well, a comment first that certainly the design is much improved, and I think committee members are grateful that you've been able to respond. And I guess I would be even happier if the branch going off to the accessible entrance could be moved even further closer to the house, which means that you'd have to add a lot of fill closer to the house so that there's just 1 or 2 steps down from there. Anyway, do you think it's not possible or reasonable to push that junction closer to the house so that it's, well, there's less impact on the landscaping?
So there's a couple challenges. First, if we completely change the grade, the house is on a hill and then it's on a little rise on that hill. What ends up happening is if we increase the grade too much, then we're reducing the number of steps from what has always existed at the house, which is one thing that we want to maintain is the look. What we have here with this design is a balance in that we're not at a steep enough grade that we need railings. So if we make those alterations, then we reach a point where likely the grade will be so steep that we'll then need railings around everything, which we feel will have greater visual impacts than the plantings. Currently, how Benedictine House looks is the porch you can almost not see because of the plantings that are located in front of the porch. And that's the look that we're looking to maintain here. This rendering, the intent of it is to give an idea. I'll be the first to say that the concrete doesn't really look like our concrete on campus and doesn't do it justice. As well, if you refer to the site plan, you'll also see that in front of the wall, there's significant plantings. And what that'll do, and the intent of those plantings, is to mimic what currently exists in front of Benedictine House. So as you approach the house, you see...
Can you use the microphone? Sorry, do move it.
Okay.